Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so get this. We're diving into the Cold War today.
Ooh, exciting.
You know, that whole containment thing under Truman and Eisenhower.
Right.
And you know what's really cool? You sent us this awesome podcast lecture.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's like for DP history students.
Wow. That's a pretty serious topic then.
It is, and you wouldn't believe the crazy twists and turns.
Like what?
Well, it's not just politics. It even affected the arts.
That's interesting.
I know, right? It's like something straight out of Hollywood.
So where do we even begin with all this?
Well, first things first, we got to figure out what containment actually was.
Yeah, that's a good starting point.
And then how did it play out differently across the U.S., Canada, and Latin America?
All right, let's break it down.
Okay, so paint us a picture.
All right, so imagine it's 1947.
Okay, post-World War II.
Exactly. Everyone's still reeling from the war.
Right.
And suddenly there's this new rivalry with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, things were getting tense.
Big time. And that's where the Truman Doctrine comes in.
Okay, so what's that all about?
Basically, the U.S. pledged to support any nation threatened by communism, like a big brother stepping in.
So they were ready to fight communism wherever it popped up.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And there's this great example in your source material.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more.
Well, Truman asked for this huge sum of money, like $400 million, to help out Greece and Turkey.
Why them?
They were both facing pressure from communist movements, and Truman saw it as a major threat.
Like a domino effect, right? If one falls, the rest will follow.
Exactly. He was determined to stop communism in its tracks.
Makes sense. So how did Canada get involved?
Well, picture this. You're Canada, and you're right across the Arctic Circle from the Soviet Union.
Uh-oh, that's a little too close for comfort.
No kidding. So Canada became a key player in this whole global standoff.
I bet they did. They couldn't just sit on the sidelines with the Soviets practically breathing down their necks.
Right, and that's why they joined the U.S. in forming NATO in 1949.
Ah, NATO, the big alliance against the Soviets.
It was more than just a military thing, though.
Oh, really? What else was it about?
It was a symbol of the West standing together against Soviet expansion.
A united front, huh?
Exactly. And that had all sorts of consequences, from increased military spending to the creation of NORAD in 1957.
Wait, what's NORAD?
The North American Aerospace Defense Command.
Oh, right, to keep an eye on the Soviet missiles, huh?
You got it. They were getting pretty advanced with their technology.
It's scary to think how close we were to a nuclear war back then.
Yeah, it was a tense time, for sure.
But wait, there's more to containment than just military stuff, right?
You're absolutely right. It had a huge impact on culture, especially in Latin America.
Things were about to get spicy down south.
It wasn't just about alliances and military bases in Latin America.
So what was it about?
It often meant direct intervention, because the U.S. was terrified of communist influence taking root south of the border.
Like they saw it as their backyard and they needed to keep it clean.
In a way, yeah, but it was obviously more complicated than that.
I bet. So what kind of intervention are we talking about?
We'll take the 1947 Rio Pact, for instance.
Okay, what was that all about?
It basically pulled Latin America into the U.S. sphere of influence, for better or for worse.
And that didn't always go over well, did it?
Not always, no.
Speaking of things not going well, what about that coup in Guatemala in 1954?
Ah, yes, that's a classic example of containment in action.
Okay, spill the tea. What happened?
Well, the U.S. suspected the Guatemalan president, Jacobo Arbenz, of being a communist sympathizer.
Oh, that's never a good label to have during the Cold War.
You said it. So the CIA got involved, there was a coup, and Arbenz was overthrown.
Wow, talk about a Cold War thriller. It's crazy how these things actually happen.
It really shows how far the U.S. was willing to go to contain communism.
Yeah, and it makes you think about the ethics of it all, you know?
Absolutely. It was a complicated situation with no easy answers.
So while the U.S. was busy intervening in Latin America back home, things were getting pretty intense too.
You mean with McCarthyism?
That's the one. It's like a whole other chapter in the Cold War story.
Definitely a dark chapter, full of fear and paranoia.
So what was McCarthyism all about? Like, what were people so afraid of?
Well, there were genuine concerns about communist infiltration in the U.S., spies and stuff.
Yeah, the Red Scare and all that.
Exactly. But those fears were often blown way out of proportion.
So it was more than just catching spies. It was about what?
It became a way to silence dissent and control people. If you didn't agree with the government, you were labeled a communist.
So even just questioning things could get you in trouble.
Pretty much. And the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg really highlights that.
Oh yeah, the couple accused of leaking atomic secrets to the Soviets.
That's them. They were executed in 1953.
Wow, that's intense.
Their trial became this symbol of the fear and paranoia gripping the nation.
Like everyone was looking over their shoulder, wondering who to trust.
Exactly. It was a time when even your own neighbors could be suspected of being communists.
And you know what's wild? This fear wasn't just limited to politics and courtrooms.
Oh, really? Where else did it reach?
It seeped into American culture, like even Hollywood wasn't safe.
Wait, Hollywood, what happened there?
Oh, you won't believe this.
Yeah, Hollywood became a prime target for this whole anti-communist crusade.
It's like they were under a microscope.
Exactly. They had this committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee.
HUAC, right?
Yep, that's the one. And they were determined to expose anyone in Hollywood suspected of communist sympathies.
Wow, so it was like a witch hunt in Tinseltown.
Pretty much.
Actors, directors, writers.
Anyone who even hinted at being a leftist could end up on the blacklist.
Oh man, the blacklist?
Yeah, it was brutal.
Careers ruined, lives shattered.
And it created this atmosphere of fear where people were afraid to speak their minds.
It's chilling to think about.
It really is.
So what happened to people who refused to cooperate with HUAC?
We'll take the case of the Hollywood 10.
Oh yeah, I've heard of them.
These were filmmakers who stood their ground, refused to name names.
Brave, but also kind of dangerous.
For sure, they were blacklisted, imprisoned, their careers basically over.
It's a stark reminder of how quickly freedom can be eroded when fear takes over.
And it wasn't just about silencing individuals.
What do you mean?
McCarthyism created this culture where people were afraid to challenge the status quo, you know.
Like, don't rock the boat, just go with the flow.
Exactly. Any dissent was seen as un-American, possibly even communist.
So did art just die during this period?
Surprisingly, no. Some artists actually found ways to resist, to hold up a mirror to society.
Really? How?
Well, think about Arthur Miller's The Crucible.
The play about the Salem witch trials.
That's the one. He wrote it in 1953, right in the middle of McCarthyism.
Oh, wow. I see the connection now.
He used the witch trials as a metaphor for what was happening in America, the mass hysteria, the false accusations.
That's brilliant, using history to comment on the present.
It was a powerful way to critique McCarthyism without directly attacking it.
So while all this was going on in the U.S., what about Latin America?
Well, containment had a different but equally significant impact there.
In what way?
Remember how the U.S. was so fixated on stopping communism?
Yeah, like it was their mission.
Well, that led them to support some pretty questionable regimes in Latin America.
Like dictators and authoritarian leaders.
Sometimes, yes, because they saw them as allies against leftist movements.
So they were willing to turn a blind eye to human rights abuses as long as it kept communism at bay.
Unfortunately, that was often the case.
And that must have had a huge impact on the culture in those countries.
Absolutely. When you have governments aligned with U.S. interests and actively suppressing dissent, it creates a very specific cultural climate.
Not a very free one, I admit.
Exactly. Artists and intellectuals who didn't toe the line faced censorship, persecution, sometimes even exile.
So it was a different kind of pressure cooker compared to McCarthyism.
Yes, but the end result was often the same. Stifled creativity and a culture of fear.
It's amazing how connected everything was during this period.
Absolutely. To understand the Cold War, you have to see how these political and cultural threads intertwine, both within the U.S. and globally.
Okay, so we've talked about McCarthyism in Latin America, but what about actual military conflicts during this time?
Well, there's one that stands out as the first major military test of containment. The Korean War.
Ah, yes, the Korean War, a forgotten war for some.
From 1950 to 1953, it was a pivotal moment in the Cold War.
What made it so pivotal?
Well, it started with North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union, invading South Korea.
So it was like a proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviets.
Exactly. And Truman, committed to containment, sent U.S. forces to defend South Korea.
It must have been a brutal conflict.
It was a very bloody and devastating war.
And what was the outcome?
Well, despite the U.S.'s military advantages, it ended in a stalemate.
A stalemate, so no clear winner.
Nope. Korea remained divided along the 38th parallel, a division that still exists today.
Wow, so the Korean War is still having repercussions today.
Absolutely. And let's not forget the continued U.S. military presence in South Korea, a lasting legacy of that Cold War conflict.
It's incredible how these historical events continue to shape the world today.
And speaking of shaping the world, the Korean War had a major impact on U.S. military strategy going forward.
How so?
Well, it made them realize that they needed to be prepared for more unconventional conflicts like Korea, where ideology was a major driving force.
It was a wake-up call, for sure.
Right, they couldn't just rely on traditional military tactics anymore.
So what did they do?
Well, when Eisenhower became president, he brought with him a new approach to containment, known as the New Look policy.
The new look, huh? Sounds fashionable.
Well, it was a significant shift in strategy.
Okay, tell me more.
Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, realized that maintaining massive armies was expensive.
Wars are expensive, who knew?
So they decided to prioritize nuclear deterrence and covert operations.
Nuclear deterrence, that sounds scary.
It was basically saying, if you mess with us, we'll nuke you.
Yikes. Talk about high stakes.
And covert operations meant using the CIA to influence events secretly.
Like that coup in Guatemala we talked about earlier.
Exactly. That was a classic example of a CIA in action under the New Look.
It's like something out of a spy movie.
And then there was the doctrine of massive retaliation.
Massive retaliation, what's that?
It was this idea that any Soviet aggression would be met with a full-scale nuclear attack.
Oh, that's taken things to a whole new level.
It was a risky strategy, but it was meant to deter the Soviets from even thinking about attacking the West.
I bet it kept them on their toes.
It definitely ramped up Cold War tensions, that's for sure.
So the New Look was a pretty controversial policy.
Very much so. It sparked a lot of debate about the effectiveness and ethics of containment.
Like, was it really about defense, or was it more about asserting U.S. dominance?
That's the million-dollar question, and historians are still debating it today.
Speaking of historians, I think it's time we talked about the different schools of thought on the Cold War.
Ah, yes, the historical perspectives.
Because, believe it or not everyone agrees on how to interpret this period.
That's what makes history so fascinating. There are always multiple sides to the story.
So let's break down these different historical camps, shall we?
Sounds good to me.
First up, we have the Orthodox historians.
Right. These historians, folks like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., tend to view U.S. actions during the Cold War as justified.
Justified? How so?
Well, they see it as a necessary response to Soviet aggression.
Like the U.S. was just protecting the free world from communism.
Exactly. They believe that containment was essential to prevent the spread of communism and safeguard democracy.
Okay, so that's the Orthodox view. What about the other side of the coin?
Well, then you have the revisionist historians.
And what do they believe?
They take a more critical stance, arguing that U.S. foreign policy, especially containment, was driven by more than just fear of communism.
Like what?
They believe that the U.S. was also motivated by economic and imperial ambitions.
So it wasn't just about protecting freedom, it was also about expanding U.S. power and influence.
That's their argument. They see containment as a way for the U.S. to assert its dominance on the world stage.
Interesting.
And then there are the post-revisionist historians.
Okay, so where do they fall on this spectrum?
They try to find a middle ground, acknowledging the complexities of the Cold War.
So not just black and white, but shades of gray.
Exactly. Historians like John Lewis Gaddis emphasize the role of misperceptions, miscalculations, and domestic politics in shaping U.S. foreign policy.
So they're saying that it wasn't just about good guys versus bad guys.
Right. They recognize that both the U.S. and the Soviet Union made mistakes and that things weren't always so clear-cut.
Makes sense. So what about the New Left historians? Where do they fit in?
They focus on the impact of U.S. intervention in the developing world, particularly in Latin America.
So they're critical of the U.S.'s role in those regions.
Very much so. They argue that U.S. support for authoritarian regimes often undermined genuine democratic movements and perpetuated inequality.
So they're saying that containment had some negative, unintended consequences.
Exactly. They challenge us to look beyond the Cold War rhetoric and examine the real-world impact of U.S. actions.
Wow, so many different perspectives on this one period in history.
It just shows how complex and multifaceted the Cold War really was.
And it reminds us that history is never a simple story. There's always more to uncover and debate.
Absolutely. And that's what makes studying history so rewarding. It's a constant process of learning and reevaluating our understanding of the past. It really shows how history is never just a straightforward narrative.
Yeah, it's like a puzzle with so many pieces.
And each piece adds to the bigger picture.
Exactly. So let's recap our deep dive today.
All right, where do we start?
Well, we trace the origins of containment back to the Truman Doctrine.
Right, that fear of the domino effect.
And we saw how it played out across the Americas,
Yeah.
from Canada joining NATO to those intense interventions in Latin America.
Like the Guatemala coup, that was a wild one.
And then there was McCarthyism back in the U.S. Talk about a culture of fear.
The Hollywood 10, blacklist, it's hard to believe that really happened.
Really? I know, and yet art still found a way to put it back, like with Arthur Miller's The Crucible.
Using the Salem witch trials to critique McCarthyism. Brilliant.
But then there was the Korean War, a real turning point in the Cold War.
The first major military test of containment, a proxy war that left Korea divided.
And it led to those strategic shifts under Eisenhower, the New Look, and massive retaliation.
Nuclear deterrence, covert operations, things got even more tense.
And we can't forget about all those different historical perspectives on the Cold War,
The orthodox, revisionist, post-revisionist, new left.
each offering a unique lens through which to view this complex period.
It's like we've been on this incredible journey through the Cold War.
And hopefully we've come out the other side with a deeper understanding of this pivotal era.
And a sense of wonder about how it continues to shape our world today.
So as we wrap up, I have one final question for you and for our listeners.
Okay, hit me.
Which historical perspective resonates most with you? Was containment a necessary defense against Soviet expansionism? Or was it driven by U.S. self-interest and a desire for global dominance?
That's a tough one. There are valid arguments on both sides.
Exactly. And as you continue to explore the Cold War, I encourage you to keep asking questions and challenging your own assumptions.
There's always more to learn and new connections to discover.
You know, like the space race or the rise of rock and roll, both influenced by the Cold War in their own way.
Fascinating how everything's connected, isn't it?
Absolutely. So keep digging deeper, keep those insights coming, and who knows, maybe you'll uncover a whole new perspective on the Cold War.
That's the beauty of history. It's always open to interpretation.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the Cold War.
Until next time, keep exploring.
And let us know what you uncover. We're always up for another deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.